for you while everyone continues to log on. We're up to about 540 people so far listening, and numbers continue to climb. So we'll give it a couple of minutes for everyone to join. This event is also being live broadcast on YouTube. Search Climate Bonds Initiative and you will find it. Very simple. Probably search EU Taxonomy as well. My friend Louisa will tell us when we're at the right numbers to get going. Just give us a couple of seconds, but thank you very much for joining us today and for being interested in what, well, at least Helena and I think, is the main game in town, the EU Taxonomy and its implementation. Of course, we will talk a little bit more about why we think that might be the case, what the issues are, and how to make it work in a few seconds. Okay, Louisa. Well, at least
we are live on YouTube and we have the right amount of numbers. You can kick off now.
Okay, we've got a bit of feedback there from the YouTube measure that you might need to put on hold next time I call you in. But thank you, everyone. We're going to get started. There are still a few people logging on. The demand, the interest in this series we are hosting has been fantastic, been extraordinary. Thank you, everyone, for your interest. I appreciate you're not just interested in listening to myself or Helena talk, you're interested in a critical topic, which is how the EU taxonomy is going to be implemented, how it's going to work, how it's going to help our challenge of addressing our environmental targets and objectives. Today, I am incredibly excited, as ever, to have Helena Viñas-Fiestas with me. Helena, well, she's been a member of the technical expert group, which filed a report in March of last year, a close friend and colleague in that process, and has also been a member of the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance, which is now governing or providing expert advice to the European Commission on the further development of the EU taxonomy and other matters around sustainable finance as the Commission wishes to get. We, for example, have done a report on transition finance presented a couple of months ago to the Commission, done in a great hurry. Helena wrote a big chunk of that for us, for the members of the platform that were part of that process. Helena is now, very exciting, drum roll, a commissioner of the Spanish Financial Markets Authority. She's had a long journey from when she was a waitress many years ago. She has done incredible things, including working in NGOs and working at BNP Paribas Asset Management for many years. She's, in other words, very understanding of the buy side, of the investor side, as well as understanding of the focus of, or the perspective of industry and other players. She's now sitting in a regulator in Spain, thinking about how to make this work, but at the same time, keeping up a lot of work on the European platform, where she chairs or co-chairs with Nadia Humphreys, the usability and data work group, of which I'm happily a follower member of. We're going to talk about the EU taxonomy, and we're going to talk about how it works. This is the first of a series of practical briefings on the EU taxonomy. I'm going to call up a slide now just to give you a sense of what we're working on. Sorry, excuse me, getting going. Helena, we're here to talk about how this thing works going forward and your thoughts on what the key issues are for this whole market. Of course, now I need to just get back to the right slide. These are some of the slides we're going to share with you. Of course, we have a couple of other sessions. So we will do a separate session next week on what it means for investors. A deep dive again of Helena and a guest speaker who will promote for you in the next 24 hours from the investment sector. After that, we'll be doing a session on what it means for corporations. Then we're going to have two special official EU platform webinars on the new proposed social taxonomy. and the new proposed taxonomy on significantly harmful or no significant impact investments. And then finally, on the 19th of July, we'll have a workshop on banks. For those of you that are preparing your summer holidays, don't worry. Everything is being recorded. You will be able to view the banks webinar on YouTube, or you can still tune in from your holiday in Malaga or Sicily as you so wish if you're keen. We will be doing a lot more of these as the year goes on, but this is the first attempt of basic introduction to how we're going. Today, it's about taxonomy usability, and it's really a 101 of taxonomies, the beginning of taxonomies, how it all works. Helena, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon to everyone.
I've got to ask you the really basic question, Helena, a really basic question. What the hell is this taxonomy, and why is there a taxonomy? Start us off.
So taxonomy just basically means classification, yeah, and the taxonomy is just the list of economic activities that can be deemed sustainable, and it also explains you know, under which circumstances you can call them or categorize as sustainable. So in a way, the taxonomy is, for me, like a dictionary, yeah, that anyone can use, can look up, you know, when you're interested about specific economic activity, so you know under which circumstances, you know, that activity is actually sustainable. But the taxonomy is also, and now I'm going to borrow your own words, Sean, it's also an inventory, right? It's like a shopping list for the future, because it tells you about the those economic activities that are material for that sustainable future that we're trying to create.
So a shopping list for the future.
Yes, absolutely, a shopping list for the future. Now, what it is important to understand about the EU taxonomy, because as you know, the first official taxonomy was actually the Chinese, is that it has, you know, let's say, three particular characteristics from my perspective. The first one is that the European taxonomy captures the contribution of an economic activity to an EU objective, environmental objective. This is the very first time that we're trying to capture environmental performance, you know, towards policy objectives. And one can argue as well that although for biodiversity or water pollution might be more localized, it is clear that for climate change mitigation, when we're talking about the objective, it is a global objective because it's been set up by scientists, which is that if we want to keep temperatures rises to 1.5 degrees, we need to meet carbon neutrality by 2050.
And that's a key feature of the taxonomy work that we've been doing, science-based, climate-focused, Paris Agreement 1.5 degree focused. This is not necessarily the case initially in the Chinese taxonomy, it's worth noting. I mean, at Climate Bonds, we're going to claim a little bit of credit here in the sense that we first came up with a taxonomy, voluntary one, not a regulated one, 9 years ago, which was a science-based one. When the Chinese adopted the taxonomy, thanks to a recommendation we made in the Green Finance Task Force of the People's Bank of China in 2014, which I was a member of, they focused it more on pollution prevention. So there are some differences compared to the approach we've taken in Europe, where we have very much focused at the recommendation of the high-level expert group on sustainable finance some years ago. Okay, and I had the chance to be a member of that, and we have resolutely stuck to this idea that science is the critical factor in determining the right outcome. In other words, not political economy constraints. You don't start with what you can do, you start with what the science says you must do, and then you work out how you might be able to get there. This is a critical switch from a lot of the conversations that have happened around national climate change plans and so on, which have generally been expressions of what member states or countries or others think is possible. And so far, so good. There have been some debates though, Helena, haven't they, about whether the execution at the Commission level is meeting that spirit. Are these material debates, do you think?
They are material, absolutely. They are material in the sense of while the taxonomy needs to be science-based, we all know that it needs to be politically feasible, right, or accepted, because at the end of the day, it's the parliament and the member states that approve it. So
good point.
In that sense, it needs to be politically accepted. Now, as you know, the platform and the tech, we really highlight the need to the extent possible that the taxonomy has to be science-based. And in that respect, as long as the threshold set, are in line with that end goal, which is carbon neutrality by 2050, then we're on the right pathway.
So that's the critical thing about this. Now, citizens and scientists, of course, can judge the cumulative effect of the taxonomy, but you've heard our intent now, everyone. So do judge us accordingly, and more to the point, judge the work of the democratic institutions of the European Union, who at the end of the day have to actually pass and manage these regulations. That's where we've got to so far. The couple of key principles behind the taxonomy, we should just alert people before we get started. Dynamic, it will change, Helena, right? We do. So what kind of review period are we looking at the moment?
Yes. So the taxonomy regulation, what it says is that the transitional activities, which we can go into detail in a minute, but basically for climate mitigation, we divided the activities in 3 types. So first of all, those who are green or low carbon already, then the transitional, and then the enabling. By transitional, what we mean, and that is being specified in the taxonomy regulation in Article 10, is those activities that are not, for which there's no low carbon technology yet known, but so therefore they can be included as long as provided, and there are 3 conditions. The first one is that they actually reflect the best performance within the sector. Secondly, that they do not hamper the development of low carbon technologies or activities. And number 3, that they don't cause, or they cannot turn into lock-in emissions. Yeah. So as long as those 3 characteristics are maintained, then we will see activities that they are not green, but they are on the right pathway. As said, they are reflecting the best performance within the market. So here is where it's been a huge progress, or a huge step from the European taxonomy compared to a lot of the market taxonomies. In the past, we hardly ever saw activities such as steel or cement part of a green investment, right? Of a green fund. Today, investors can include those as long as they look in, to those who meet threshold set by the taxonomy. And those are the thresholds, precisely those thresholds are the ones who need to be reviewed every 3 years.
I guess when you say,
yes?
I guess when you say technologies available now, we mean technologies that are financially viable, because in a lot of these challenges, you could spend a fortune in getting all steel being zero carbon, but it's not going to happen very quickly because of the availability of the cost structures and so on. So, yeah. However, I think it is worth noting, Helena, that in every sector, we are still looking at a trajectory of change, which is consistent of achieving our 2030 goals. That's an important point, isn't it?
It is a very important point. So just very quickly, yes, what the taxonomy regulation actually says is that they need to be both technologically and economically feasible, in order to be included. And absolutely, I think that the big debate right now is precisely that, is to say, okay, so we know your shopping list for 2050, right? It might look like this. Now, what is the shopping list for 2030? Yeah, there might be some activities whose sunset, who are needed today, but they need to, they cannot be part of that 2050 carbon neutral economy. Yeah, and that's a big debate. What sometimes we call the interim activities. I think Climate Bonds Initiative actually call them the interim activities, correct? So right. It is about how can we go beyond the green activities and look at those activities who are either significantly harmful or somewhere in between significant, harmful, and substantial contribution, and how we can, draw their own or capture the efforts that the economic actors that conduct those activities can also be reflected, and support those actors, because they also need to transition. But that's a key question mark in terms from a political point of view, if I may say. It's a big question mark of whether or not the EU will be able to set sunset dates or to develop those sectoral pathways that they are so demanded by the industry.
At the moment, we've got a regular review period, right, for transition sectors. Is that every 3 years?
It's every 3 years, absolutely. So that's every 3 years. And what we have, I think that we need to distinguish what it is that it is already in the taxonomy, included both in the taxonomy regulation and in the delegated acts on climate change, which are the transitional activities, which respond to the definition I just made, to those ones. And maybe Sean, we can even show the slide. I think it's the last slide, but it always helps. Okay, there you go. And we need to distinguish with what it is to expand the taxonomy to cover other activities other than sustainable. So basically, we're talking about harmful, significantly harmful activities and those activities in between. So let's review for everyone. I think it will be clearer, right? If we explain them a little bit, what's the calendar? Because it can be quite complex. Yes. And yes, you were going to say?
No, I think you're absolutely right. So just tell me, what's the critical data I've got to worry about if I'm an investor or a corporation or someone who has to look at reporting here? Of these dates, what have to be?
The key dates we are all really looking at right now, it's the 30th of June. Yeah, the 30th of June is the last day that the Commission has for the adoption of the delegated acts on Article 8. I recall everyone, Article 8 is that famous article within the taxonomy regulation that basically says that financial and non-financial companies that have to report under the non-financial reporting directive, which now has changed the name just to complicate things a little bit more, to corporate sustainability report.
Okay, so the corporate sustainability reporting directive takes over from the NFRD, yes. The beautiful acronym.
Exactly.
Important everyone to note that.
Absolutely. And what is important about the change is not so much the name, but the fact that it has expanded tremendously the number of companies it covers. I think somebody said that it was over 50,000. Yeah. And this is because it includes private companies, so companies who are not listed, large non-listed companies. And secondly, it includes listed SMEs, and it draws the threshold for the companies who are included at the official definition of SME in Europe, which is basically, to cut a long story short, 250 employees, less than 250 employees. There are two other variables.
So every company larger than that is going to be governed by this directive, right?
Absolutely.
And you're telling me the deadline is next week?
No. And then, which means that is the scope of all the companies that will have to report on the taxonomy, which is Article 8. Now, what happens the 30th of June is that the Commission is going to publish the Delegated Act, which basically means the details of what, and the methodology, and the format.
Okay, so we'll know what the final thing looks like.
Exactly. And we will know, companies would know what they have to report. They will know exactly, what is demanded of them in terms of the taxonomy.
Helena, you mentioned something called Article 8. What's Article 8? I've heard a lot about it.
Yes. So may I take one step backwards? And I think it's always, when you tell a story, it gets, it's easier to remember. I don't know if you remember shown. But at the very beginning, actually for quite a long time within the tech, we kept on saying, a few of us banking saying, it will be impossible for investors to disclose the proportion of their funds that is taxonomy aligned if they don't have information from companies, right? And I think that our calls were heard because in the final taxonomy regulation, it was included this article 8, which was included afterwards. I mean, it was not in the draft taxonomy regulation. That's what I mean by afterwards. And basically says that non-financial companies that fall under the scope of the non-financial reporting directive, today the CSRD, need to disclose the percentage of their turnover that is generated from taxonomy aligned activities, and also the Capex, capital expenditures, and operational expenditures that they make, on that they are taxonomy aligned. So basically, that is for non-financial companies. For financial companies, basically it said that the delegated acts that will be published, so the one is going to be published on the 30th of June, will say exactly what they have to disclose and the methodology and so forth. Let's put it this way, financial institutions' disclosure of the taxonomy is slightly more complicated from a conceptual perspective.
Okay, fair enough. By the way, while I'm at it, Article 5 and Article 6, what do these mean?
So Article 5 and 6, which were from the very beginning within the taxonomy regulation, in the draft taxonomy regulation, basically says that investors, so financial market participants, this is asset owners and asset managers, that they need to disclose the percentage, the proportion of their portfolios or funds that they're taxonomy aligned. But it's not about all funds. It is about either, and this is Article 5, those funds that have an environmental objective that now we're in the industry, normally we refer to them as thematic funds, sustainability thematic funds. And then Article 6 says, or that they promote, they're commercialized with an environmental characteristic, which is the equivalent to Article 8 of the disclosures regulation. Just for to make it clear for the investors that might be listening to the seminar. So 5 and 6 are 8 and 9 of the disclosures regulation. This is where they meet, and it's not only.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm still confused. But folks, we're going to come back to this in the future weeks. So for everyone who is listening, the first thing is to know if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A button. We will attempt to tackle some of the questions before we finish. We might have to visit some of them in future weeks or by email. I'll let you know. I'm afraid there's no raising hands here, Bertrand Vale. You need to ask a Q&A question. Sorry about that. We don't have the space and technology to do it because we've got more than 1,000 people online. But thank you for your interest. Please do ask a Q&A question. Can I say that this session will be recorded? Remember I said YouTube. You'll be able to find it under Climate Bonds Initiative or EU Taxonomy, or go to the Climate Bonds website and we'll send around some information about it. You can register for all the other sessions, the same place you register for this, you'll get the details. I'm, of course, Sean Kidney, the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. I'm a member of the EU platform along with Helena, who is my leader as the co-rapporteur of the Usability and Data Group. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Helena, going back to other questions now. So we've been talking about the mechanics, the plumbing of how all this works, and of course the timing. We didn't finish off on the timing though, as to when the reporting regulation or obligation starts. So at the moment, I'm assuming that's a bit up in the air, but which of these dates do I have to worry about if I'm an investor or a company?
It's a very good question, because what I'm going to say now, listeners need to take it with a pinch of salt, in the sense of we have an idea of what it's more likely to happen, but until we don't have the delegated acts, we cannot be 100% sure, yeah? So according to the draft delegated acts on Article 8, companies, so let's start with companies. Companies will have to report during 2022, not the turnover or the Capex and OPEX that is taxonomy aligned, but only the percentage of those three, only the percentage of the revenues that it is derived from taxonomy eligible activities. And by eligible, we mean that those activities that for which they have technical criteria. Now, that means it will only be on the following year that companies will have to disclose the whole thing as stated on Article 8. That's been a change. I think it's been a massive change because it was not previewed or envisioned like that. But because the climate, the delegated acts had not been published until quite late, and the delegated acts, I think that there's been this big concession to the industry. However, we won't know it for sure until we have the final delegated acts. But most likely, I don't see why the Commission would change its mind, in the delegated acts. Now, the big question now, is there going to be the same sort of exemption for or postponement for Article 5 and 6? This is for financial investors, and that is yet to be seen, because where we are at, and I will can close this chapter of the webinar, where we are at is that the ESAs, the European Supervisory Authorities, run a consultation on Article 5 and 6, and they need to publish their advice, and then it's for the Commission to publish the final act. So the final details for financial market participants.
But essentially, it looks like we've got a bit of time to get our head around this once the act is finished, right? So it's not going to hit us on the 31st of December this year. We can breathe a bit.
Definitely not, definitely, most likely not companies from what we've seen. Now we need to see what happens with financial market participants. But I guess if we are to be coherent, we have a little bit more time. So first concentrate on eligibility and then on alignment.
But a lot of people are already using your taxonomy anyway on a voluntary basis, aren't they? Both
Absolutely.
Investors and some corporations.
Yes, and I think it's so encouraging, to see players, both companies and investors, to start looking at it. I think from an investment perspective, what it is really interesting is to see how some investors are starting to readapt their own taxonomies, if you wish, because now we have this official science-based, very detailed classification. That must be said as well, Sean, that the majority of the taxonomies that there were in the market were not so detailed, at that level of detail. So what we're seeing is that readjustment. What we're also seeing, and that was at least the case before I left BNP Paribas Asset Management, is using the taxonomy as part of their engagements, companies' engagements. For example, on the Climate Action 100 Plus benchmark, the taxonomy was included, as one of variables to verify what companies' plans and the efforts they're making towards the transitioning.
Just for our listeners, the Climate Action 100 Plus is an association of investors, a group of investors looking to push climate action in their engagement with corporations. So very interesting they're using your taxonomy.
Absolutely. What they're using, this is a global initiative. So what they're using is green revenues, right? So in Europe, using the EU taxonomy as the reference point. But it is quite logical, because let's just give you a quick example. A lot of those big companies have started to make commitments also in terms of the capital investors, Capex and the revenues. So they would say, I commit, 80% of my Capex by 2030 that's going to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. Now, what does it mean to be aligned, for expenditures to be aligned with the Paris Agreement? How does an investor, verify that? And what the taxonomy gives you, it's an official, reference, and you would have the exact percentage of Capex alignment for that company to the taxonomy. So that is a really step forward for investors, because it provides them the certainty, and a tool to verify companies' commitments and the paths they are following.
Elena, in your comment on Capex, I've got this thing ringing my ears, which is Capex and OPEX, right?
Yes.
You can choose what you report in. How does this work?
No. So let's start with the basics, in the sense of if turnover or revenues give you a picture where companies are, and even slightly backwards, because it sort of like captures, the results of the efforts that companies have made. So the percentage where they are today, the companies, Capex, which captures the investments that a company makes to either strengthen or expand an activity that is already taxonomy aligned, or to render an activity taxonomy aligned. So Capex gives you that direction of travel. So when we talk about OPEX, in a way, OPEX that refers, and this is following both the recommendations of the TEC, but also of ESMA, it is like complementing Capex, where OPEX that need to be reported are those non-capitalized investments to maintain or achieve taxonomy alignment. So in a way, the OPEX, not in a way, but the operational expenditures that will have to be reported is not every single expenditure of the company, but those who are essentials to either maintain or remain taxonomy aligned, or to render an activity taxonomy aligned. So the classic one would be also, for example, R&D. You will have some R&D that will be capitalized and some R&D that are not capitalized. So basically, OPEX is complementing Capex. But
you said something really important then, to render something taxonomy eligible. So we know, that if you own something that is sustainable, as per the taxonomy, you can declare that and include that. And, the green bonds market has refinancing CSS. But you've mentioned OPEX that renders something eligible. So
yes.
Just give me a bit more about what that means.
Capex, so both. All the investments that a company does to either strengthen an activity that's taxonomy aligned, to maintain that activity taxonomy aligned, or, as you were saying, render an activity taxonomy aligned, or an asset can be counted. So let's focus on that, rendering an asset or an activity taxonomy aligned. So today you might be a company that is 0% taxonomy. That 0% of the revenues of your revenues are taxonomy aligned, but you are committed to the transition. Yes. So the investments you make, for example, to diversify your portfolio and invest in taxonomy aligned company, or to make changes to your plans or your activities in order to become taxonomy aligned, can be counted as taxonomy aligned, as long as they're part of an investment plan, which at the end, the end goal is to become taxonomy aligned. Now, of course, those investment plans cannot be last forever. So what the tech recommended in the platform was 5 years as the average, but some exceptions to be given, for big infrastructure projects or heavy industry. The draft delegated acts of the Commission said that 5 years as the norm, and 7 years, it could go up to 7 years. Let's see what the
up to 7 years, right? That's quite a long period.
Yes. So the idea, it is a little bit, it works a little bit like green bonds, So you just need to disclose some information that gives that reassurance to investors and to supervisors. Your investment plan needs to have been approved by a administrative body of the company, and hopefully verified, externally verified, that is still, under discussion. And therefore, once you've done that, all the investments that you make for for rendering or for meeting your investment plan, then can be counted. And that is really important. Why is so important? Because investors, when I imagine I'm an investor, I will report on my fund, I will report on the revenue alignment, but also on the Capex alignment. And this is already the case for some investors. When you select, the companies to invest, you might select them because they have a large or a high percentage of revenues aligned, or you might say, I'm going to invest actually in my fund in those companies who have a high percentage on Capex, and whose transition pathways, strategy seem to me very solid. I could, companies who are today 0% from a revenue perspective aligned, they could be up to 100% from a Capex perspective.
So actually there's some options here about how we do this. And I just love the idea of a time scale deliver. Of course, that requires what Carbon World used to call MRV, monitoring, reporting and verification on an ongoing basis, right? So you want to make sure people are delivering.
Well, but if you think that every year, as part of the company's obligation to report on the non-financial statement, they will have to report on the revenues, but also on the Capex, all the investments they've done that year, on that investment plan. And at the same time, they will have to disclose some elements of that investment plan and who has ratified it and so forth, Investors every year will be able to check, whether or not they're delivering, the same way as investors do today with the green bonds when they're asking you about the reports, right?
Mm-hmm.
Asking you about the reports, and they verify, how things are going. Are you meeting your commitments?
So actually, this is pretty revolutionary, isn't it? Wow. I get.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Well, I was going to say, speaking from with your previous hat on, how influential do you think this is really going to be in finance and in mobilizing capital for Europe? This is a labeling scheme. This is not a policy direction. We're not ruling anything out or anything in this scheme. Well, what's your thoughts on how influential?
I keep saying that for me, there are two huge revolutionary traits of the taxonomy. The first one is Capex. Investors, when you talk to portfolio managers, they've been dying to have details on capital expenditures, because think about it, capital expenditures is telling you the direction of travel of the company, and you can actually imagine company X is giving you that full-on strategy. The Capex is a more tangible, a really tangible metric that year after year is telling you to what extent they're meeting, their commitments and and whether or not that strategy is solid. So for portfolio managers and investors, it is lifting the level of the conversation and the level of information to a different level. It's going to a higher level, because now they can, as said, they can really scrutinize, or they can companies' transition plans, with something very, very solid and material. I can think of several examples from my previous life, if you wish, where some companies were making huge statements around committing to carbon neutrality. But then you look at their investments, and you could see that they were not making any real effort towards those, So this is really, really critical. The second reason is because until now, when we built green funds, we were basically creating them based on the revenues, So that means that we were by default limiting it to companies who were already quite green, because you need to have. By having Capex, you're literally opened the door for all those companies who are making efforts, who might be zero. So it is making the whole green investment particularly in equity, much more forward-looking.
So we can expect a change in discourse at investors and at corporations and at banks, right? Because banks will eventually be affected by this as well.
Absolutely. The other thing, if I may very quickly tell you about the expenditures, the good news, the good news is that it's particularly for the debt market, right?
Right.
Because what we're saying here is that all the finance, that actually given to a company for meeting their investment plans can be labeled as green, right? So whether it's a series of loans or whether it's one bond, right? As long as in this case, you will need a use of proceeds. You will need to ring fence the expenditures, correct? But what we're saying is that it doesn't have to be that after that one loan ensures that the outcome is going to make the activity or an asset green. It can be a series of loans. It doesn't matter.
So this should be much more flexible for banks by the time we're finished in terms of the number of things they can include and so on.
Absolutely, much more flexible. I think it is a huge opportunity for banks to be innovative and creative in terms of the financial products, because the taxonomy regulation doesn't say anything about how you translate then the taxonomy into financial products. Now we've been hearing over and over about sustainability linked bonds, right? It's the new kit in the block, right? So why not having that target, that link to a Capex target, for example?
There you go. Hey, folks, there's a new idea for sustainability linked bond. Yes. As you can see, implications all over the place. We will be next week doing a drill down for investors. We will then afterwards, the week after, being corporations, and late in July, we'll be having a drill down for implications for the banking sector. Someone of the questions asked about citizens. Will there be a conversation for citizens? Well, to a certain degree, this is, but I want to stress that in September, we will be starting up a webinar program again, and it'll be looking at other kinds of focus as we go forward. So, of course, the focus for citizens like you and I will become part of that ongoing discourse. This is not just a summer activity. This is an activity that will keep on going because we need to explain this again and again sometimes. I'm having trouble understanding some of the implications, but I want everyone to understand that while it looks complicated now, when you're designing an electric car, it looks complicated too. But by the time you've finished, we all just get in, press a button and drive off. This is our ambition with the work around the taxonomy. We are in the middle of design and construction. Of course, it looks complicated. There's wiring all over the place. Let's see where we get to next year. I hope that's fair enough, Helena,
yes.
to say.
And can I say one thing about the citizens, which is really, I think it is also quite revolutionary, linked to the taxonomy, which is we tend to forget that there's a third user mandatory user within the taxonomy regulation. That's member states and the EU that says that they need to, when setting up standards or labels or certifications, they need to use the taxonomy for those, right? And the first example that we have on the table is the Ecolabel, This is a label that is based on the taxonomy for funds, for the retail market, for citizens, for you and for I. And why I'm mentioning it is because the power of the taxonomy many times lies not only on what the taxonomy regulation says the taxonomy does, but in the ecosystem of policy measures that's being created around it. And why I mention this is that there is one policy measure that I think it is critical and so important, which is the inclusion of ESG preferences in a suitability test. Basically means that when you shall go to your bank, and you say, I have a little bit of savings here and I want to invest. Nowadays, they make you a risk test, and a risk profile in order to know which funds or investments are suitable for you. in the future, they will also ask you about your environmental social preferences. And if you, Sean, say, yes, I have, I care about the environment, I have an environmental preference, you would have several products and you would see the percentage of alignment of the taxonomy. And you may say to me, but that maybe is more complicated to truly understand for the average citizen that it has not been involved in the whole taxonomy development. Totally right. But I would say to you the same way that I am truly ignorant when it comes to chemistry. I go to the supermarket and I buy the detergent that has the Ecolabel, because all I need to know is that that label guarantees me that it's environmentally sound. You would have the same when it comes to products, Ecolabel. And that opens the door for the very first time to citizens to also contribute to finance the transition at the same time that they will, they will get returns, financial returns for their investments.
And that's the critical theme here, is that we believe, the taxonomy believes, the Commission believes, this transition will provide sustainable returns in two ways, financially and environmentally. It should be a win-win, but we need to know, we need to know easily what does qualify before we can start deploying our money accordingly. And all of this thing together will lead to a transition, a change. It does not get in the way or stop or the need for government action. Clearly, government action, regulatory measures, on policy measures is still absolutely essential. It simply defines our priorities. It is, as Helena said at the beginning, an inventory or a shopping list for the future. That's what it is. We still have to do the shopping. We've got a pile of questions, I have to say, Helena. One question first is, who enforces this? Now, I'm looking at you as a regulator. Who enforces this? How does this work?
So the Commission sort of writes up, right, the regulation that has to, as long as its regulation has to be also approved by the Parliament and the Member States, yeah? And then it depends on which types of regulation and delegated acts, then it is at national level or at European level. So in the case of the non-financial reporting directive, sorry, I keep calling it non-financial, corporate sustainable reporting directive, yeah, the supervisory will lie into the national authorities, yeah. In the case of Spain, for example, it will be us, yeah, verifying that companies meet, that actually have disclosed everything that is requested, which amongst those things, it will be the taxonomy, revenue alignment, turnover alignment, Capex alignment, and OpEx alignment, and the details and the narratives. So it will be the national authorities in the case of the taxonomy.
Okay, so the national regulatory authorities will be in charge of implementation, verification, essentially, or confirming the verification has happened. Is there any scope for leakage that someone might say, oh, it's all too hard, I'm moving to a jurisdiction where they're a bit light on this? Or is the investor pressure, because there's going to be so strong that realistically that's just a ridiculous idea?
I would be surprised. I mean, never say, it would never happen, but I would be surprised if a company will shift, its headquarters because of the taxonomy reporting, yeah. But more importantly is whether or not that happens is that the investors, yeah, and this is a critical mass of investors that are looking very closely at this, will scrutinize companies' reporting if it doesn't make any sense. Remember that now, not only investors, but also banks, because banks and investors in turn will have to report against the taxonomy, and their disclosures is directly correlated to the disclosures of the companies. And I think this is something that companies need to keep really in mind, which is the minute that investors and banks, are also obliged to report and to use the taxonomy in that sense, the number one priority for them will be to meet the regulatory requirements. So in a way, it shifts the center of gravitas, yeah, and their reporting will be even more important. So I think it would be, it wouldn't be a very wise idea, may I say. Sharon.
Very clever, Helena. Tell me, international application, how will this affect, well, for a start, investors in Europe that have investments in America or Asia or Africa, or companies trying to raise money in Europe?
Yeah, so when we think about the international angle, I would say we need to think about 3 different levels, yeah? Mm-hmm. So the first one is, how will it affect, European investors or European financial institutions and European companies? And for that to say that their reporting has to be or one of consolidated reporting, which basically means that what they need, the same way that they report for the non-financial reporting directive, the same scope applies for the taxonomy. So basically means that for their operations abroad, they will have to apply as well the taxonomy. The second question is about how we can make the taxonomy, the current taxonomy, more internationally friendly, yeah? And Sean, of this, we've been having quite a lot of discussions within the platform. Our meaning the data and usability team has been saying, look, we need to work towards whether that who actually ends up doing this international platform finance on sustainable finance or the European Commission, another body, but we need to start creating tables of equivalences of number one of the European classification of activities. So it is friendly for international players as well. And that, as you know, the platform has start working on that, but more work needs to be done. And secondly, it's around all the do no significant harm criteria that today refers to European regulation. But that is perfectly normal and understandable, and we truly support it. We need to make it easier for non-EU players. So we need to translate, right, into international standards, those regulations. And the third point I would say is, and I don't know if you want to go there, is whether or not, it will be one day feasible to have a global taxonomy or different regional taxonomies, but done in a way where it's easy for particularly investors and financial institutions to apply different taxonomies of different regions to their different investments, yeah? And what my advice would be, and I can go more into the details, is that what is really important is that we share the same structure skeleton and the same metrics, that we use the same environmental and financial metrics, that we understand the same by those, and that we share the same structure, yeah?
Critical points. I can tell you, because I'm involved in taxonomies around the world, is the basic structure of the EU taxonomy is now being used in taxonomy development in multiple countries. The South African taxonomy, the Colombian taxonomy will be very reminiscent of the European taxonomy, but there will be local differences, including in the areas you mentioned around the equivalent of EU regulation and so on. So there will need to be a bit of work around equivalence and recognition, mutual recognition. Someone asked about the Chinese taxonomy. I can tell you, because it's public news, there is a working group, we've had some involvement in it, which is leading towards a common ground taxonomy between Europe and China. We plan to publish an initial draft report in September with a goal for later this year, making available for global usage areas where China and Europe agree. And China has, for example, according to Yi Gang, the governor of the People's Bank of China, on a Network for Greening the Financial System webinar a couple of weeks ago, excluded fossil fuel power from electricity generation, which is consistent with the taxonomy as of today in Europe, and also introduced some do no significant harm provisions. So we're seeing emerging. We don't have a global government at this stage. Whether we want to or not is an entirely separate question. But what we do have is a a willingness, I think, on the part of different governments and regulators around the world to work together to harmonise, much of which will happen underneath the umbrella of the EU-led International Platform on Sustainable Finance, which is an association of half the world's GDP now, looking at how we can collaborate on sustainable finance. But it is a work in progress, isn't it, Helena? It's something we're clearly not finalised.
It's clearly not finalized, but one of the things I always say is that if we could at least, and I think this is broader than just the taxonomy, but the same way that we have managed in the world to have a approximate same definition on what revenues are or turnover or capital investments, yeah, even if it might have a slight difference in different regions, cannot we have the same understanding on the different environmental metrics and the methodologies, the underlying methodologies to calculate them? Because I think that one of the biggest nightmares for investors and financial institutions is the not being able to aggregate, yeah, or to compare apples. So at least the basics, yeah, the pillars and the structure needs to be the same.
I've got a question about private versus public sector, member states, municipalities, and so on. And will it apply to them? But just on the international, I want to say, someone asked a question about the US. There is not a US taxonomy. We hear rumours that the US is considering doing some form of green definitions work. Nothing's been announced, nothing public yet. But I'll tell you one thing, I have heard it won't be called a taxonomy because in the US they can't have the letters TAX in anything. That's all I can tell you for certain.
Remind me at the very beginning, a lot of people would ask, you know, what it has to do, what is the link with taxes?
That's true, those days have gone. But this public sector, will public sector bodies be covered or affected?
Well, it's a fascinating question, yeah, because you were saying at the very beginning, you know, what a little bit of how much, let's call it movement and talk that has been around the taxonomy. And I think that there has been so much movement for two reasons. One is because a lot of people, yeah, I mean, taxonomy, what is that? Didn't really know to what extent the taxonomy was going to be revolutionary, yeah? And I think it was until the first or the final report of the tech, you know, that was on the table that people start understanding, wow, you know, what it meant. But the second reason, and I think it is really material for what we're discussing, is because of COVID, yeah, and COVID crisis. What it did is that whole new discussion started for the very first time at EU level about whether or not there should be some sort of green conditionality put into the recovery funds. And that meant, you know, and then the question was, what should be, you know, the role of the taxonomy in that, and whether or not it should be linked or used as a screening mechanism. And then is when a lot of member states woke up and realized that the taxonomy, you know, had started to have its own life and was beyond the private sector. And that might explain some of the latest developments or discussions, because whether or not, and the extent to which at the end it will be included in the recovery funds, what is clear is that it's unstoppable. The European Commission already has committed, I think it's 25 or 28% of its budget to the taxonomy. The European Investment Bank has already announced that it will no longer finance fossil fuel related type of projects, and that it will follow the taxonomy to the extent of possible. And we know that the expectation is that the public sector, whether we talk about their own green bonds or whether we talk about their own investments in terms of some of the public sector authorities. Think about the central banks. Central banks are key asset owners as well. How are they investing? Yeah. Pensions link public pensions, yeah, and so forth. Whether or not those would also have to follow the taxonomy to a certain extent. Green procurement for governments, yeah, and of course what I call the new elephant in the room, which is sovereign debt. You know, for the time being, it's been excluded, but nothing impedes to apply the taxonomy to sovereign debt. Yes, there needs to be work done in order to adapt the taxonomy so it can be used for sovereign debt, but it makes perfect sense because a lot of investors actually are already applying some sort of ESG filter to sovereign debt. So cannot they claim, you know, that they are taxonomy aligned to a certain extent, that they are sustainable? For the time being, the discussion has been postponed, but I don't think it can be postponed eternally.
And it's certainly true that many green sovereign debt issuers in Europe are looking very closely at taxonomy, and we certainly expect that we will see alignment very quickly in that area, which will have a flow-on effect. The European Investment Bank, of course, is already using the taxonomy, and I want to just call out Nancy Sach, who's on the call today, who will be presenting a webinar in this series on the 13th of the month on the proposals for significantly harmful and no significant impact taxonomies under the EU platform recommendations on EU taxonomy. So please make sure you join for that, and you'll hear more from Nancy.
Yes, can I highlight about the importance is that while we have doubts, I mean, not doubts, but while we have to do quite a lot of work in how to apply the taxonomy to general sovereign debt, it's absolutely essential that we start using it for use of proceeds type of bonds, whether we're talking about issued by sovereign, sub-sovereign, or supranationals, yeah? Because let's remember the important role of municipalities that they have in renovations of buildings, for example.
Absolutely. And someone asked a question about actually what's the advice for municipalities, and I think, Helena, our advice would be start engaging, start looking at how it applies. It will inevitably affect you over time, but more to the point, if you're trying to raise money in any way, as some municipalities are, Ile-de-France and Paris and Malmo and Gothenburg, for example, issue green bonds or sustainable bonds. They will need to meet the taxonomy if investors are going to invest them as sustainable instruments.
Yeah, and it will be, otherwise, I think that it will take away one of the biggest incentives for the investment community to buy those bonds, yeah, to be able to claim them as green and add them in their green funds.
So, Helena, I've just put up your last couple of slides because I thought we should just have a quick look at them. But of course, everyone, this webinar is being recorded. So you'll be able to listen and just look at the slides if you want separately. You can go to the Climate Bonds website, look for webinars, or you can go to YouTube and search for EU Taxonomy or Climate Bonds Initiative to find the webinars. Tell me where you'd like to stop. This is just a teaser for everyone. It's about providing clarity for investors. I'll move on.
I guess the important thing about this is you remember that said one of the key roles of the taxonomy is to provide clarity to investors. What do we mean? Well, it's a little bit like with food products. If you say that your product is low fat, the least you can ask is to say how much fat it has and whether or not that is too much, right? So the taxonomy, for the taxonomy is the same. If you market your fund as environmentally sustainable, the least you can ask is, you know, how sustainable it is. And because like with fat, the majority of us, we don't know whether 51 grams of fat is too much or too little. You want the official reference, and that's the taxonomy, yeah? So in essence, what we wanted is to say, for each euro that you invest to your clients, to say X cents are invested in green activities, are green investments. Okay, this one refers to the Capex and discussion we were having and how Capex is forward looking and actually it's really capturing the transition of companies, yeah? And this is, it was just an example that I made up of a company called Eureka. It's a car manufacturer. Imagine it has 4 plants, but only one of them it's manufacturing electrical vehicles, and it's fully, the vehicles are fully aligned with the taxonomy. So it's 20% turnover alignment, but it has an ambition to become, you know, carbon neutral by, let's say, 2040. It's very ambitious company. So how this company says, okay, I'm going to start with plant B and I'm going to also upgrade my plant B so it manufactures electric vehicles, yeah? And it says, and not only that, I want to, I have built one of my plants, plant D, it's actually in a flood risk area. So I want to adapt, to make it resilient and renovate the actual plant to make energy efficiency. And I also, just another example is that this company is also really investing in R&D to improve the performance of the electric batteries. Yeah. So what we are calling for the platform is that all R&D investments in green technologies or in taxonomy aligned activities, technologies, you know, they can just be counted as green without the need of an investment plan. But anyway, here you have the example. This company says by 2025, 80% of my Capex will be invested in green. This is, you know, what I'm going to invest it in. So every year, 2021, 2022, and so forth, every year, at the end of the year, we'll report how much of those investments have made to get them to meet their 2025 targets.
Okay, so you can apply this, folks, to any kind of entity or activity in principle in terms of understanding how you can do the transition. We'll provide more guidance later in the year around this question of transition, but this just underlines how important this transition concept is. Now, the reason I say this, I've had queries over the last few weeks from Japan, from Latin America, from ASEAN, about what is this transition? Is it separate to the taxonomy or is it part of the taxonomy? Message, it's part of the taxonomy. It's still about achieving our science-based environmental objectives, but it's a particular aspect to how to do it and supporting companies and enterprises and municipalities and member states potentially who are changing. That's really the key point about it. Let me move on to this, how it already supports transition.
Well, this is just to show that the taxonomy is a critical variable, but it doesn't operate in a vacuum. Yeah, it's when it comes, the taxonomy relates to activity level, it's at asset level, and then companies will be reporting at entity level for their overall activities, for all their activities. And what it is important to understand is that there is a difference between the investment plan, which is there to support my capital expenditures towards rendering an activity taxonomy aligned, or to expand or strengthen an activities taxonomy aligned, as opposed to my overall transition or decarbonization strategies. What we recommend, and this is just a recommendation, voluntary, is that the same way that companies, at least the largest companies, tend to start disclosing on the short, medium, and long-term emission reductions, you know, we suggest they also share what their Capex alignment targets are, you know, and even green revenues aspirational targets. So when they describe their strategies to investors, to include the taxonomy there, because that's going to give even much more reassurance to investors, and it's going to make them more attractive. Yeah, the taxonomy also it's a guide on how to become climate resilient. So, you know, use the taxonomy to develop your adaptation strategy as well.
Very good point. And everyone, I think underpinning this is an understanding amongst the investment community, as well as amongst governments in Europe, is that the shape of the future has been decided. We know that it will eventually be clean and green. The real issue now is the speed at which we get there and what specific investments are pertinent and relevant here. And the more on the issuance side or the reporting side, you can make a case along these lines, using the common language, the taxonomy, the easier it will be. But there's some detail on this page, Helena. I'm going to suggest we just leave it.
Me too. Can I just highlight one thing?
Please.
That you made me think, which is a very important point, which is Europe has enshrined into law that it's going to be carbon neutral by 2050. So the taxonomy might be a little bit in advance, just a little bit more in advance of what definitely policy is going to arrive, or regulation will be, because at the end of the day, as I said, all economic activities need to reach net zero. What the taxonomy does is it gives the opportunity to companies and economic actors to access finance, to access better finance, because investors and financial institutions in the near future, or shall I say immediate future, as soon as they start reporting, they're going to have a real incentive in looking good in terms of the percentage of their assets under management that they are taxonomy aligned, both in terms of revenues and Capex, which basically means that it is very feasible. I think that what we're going to see is that the cost of capital for those companies that they are either have a high level of revenues aligned with the taxonomy, or that their finance, can be called green, they will have a lower cost of capital. And that's the whole point of the exercise. It is to provide better and cheaper access to capital for the transition.
That's exactly it. Beautiful. We've got 2 minutes and I'm going to throw a couple of questions at you. For example, border tax. Valdis Dombrovskis bringing in a border tax. Apparently, all these proposals, let me be clear about this, proposals for a carbon tax, a border carbon tax. Will this relevant? Is the taxonomy going to be able to be useful for those sort of proposals? Can you see? And this is really an idea about how the taxonomy could be relevant for various other proposals coming in.
Gosh, that's the first time you're really putting me in the spotlight, making it think. I think that what definitely we can say is that if there is a border tax, there's even a higher incentive for non-European companies that their products are being sold in the EU to reduce their emissions. And if those companies want to reduce their emissions, one way they can access capital in Europe to do so if they use the taxonomy.
And the border tax could use the taxonomy as guidance for things that get an open access, that get easier access through to Europe, because these are things that are consistent with Europe's environmental objectives. So the scope. People have asked about gas and nuclear. We're not going to go into the detail now. I will simply say the official taxonomy that's gone to the Parliament for approval at the moment does not include nuclear, nor does it include electricity generation with emissions above 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. The Commission has said that in Q4, it will have a further examination of the question of gas, which is generally emissions above that threshold, or nuclear. And so there'll be further discussions about it all. In other words, they're not off the table yet, but there's some debate. You might have picked that up, by the way. There is some debate about these issues. So it's not actually over yet, but they're not in there currently now. There are other areas that have been portrayed in the media as areas of controversy. Of course there are. This is a democratic process between member states. There are arguments. There are things I'm out there campaigning for still. Every citizen should look at the criteria and make a determination of what fits the science-based idea. This is the nature of a democracy, and have your say at your member state or with your relevant democratic institutions. That's why it's an exciting area. But I think the key thing is we have an extraordinary, revolutionary initiative underway now, which is common language, common ground taxonomy to guide the development of the sustainable finance market, to provide guidance for reporting on behalf of all major financial institutions in Europe and potentially public sector institutions as well. As Helena said, this is an amazing development, isn't it? I mean, Helena, we need to wrap up, but what an extraordinary project this has been for the European Commission. I guess you have to say, you've been in this for a long time. You're still in it. So you must still think this is, like I do, the big kahuna, the main game.
You know that I would say like a few months in the tech. I published an article said the 21st century metric system, the taxonomy is a 21st century metric system, and I truly believe it. Yeah, we've been going around how we can internalize environmental externalities for ages. The taxonomy is a tool to help to exactly do that. Yeah, and we need to make the most out of it, because the challenge we have ahead of us, really deserves it. I mean, otherwise, we need the taxonomy, we need carbon pricing, we need all the policy measures that we can, because we have less than 30 years to meet carbon neutrality.
So thank you for being with us today. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and ideas. Thank you everyone for listening in. I appreciate there are many questions we haven't been able to answer. We have hundreds of questions here, some of which we will attempt to follow, but a lot of the questions will be addressed in the general communication explaining how this works that will begin to appear as the formal process of adoption in Europe completes. So after the Parliament votes the taxonomy, for example, you will expect some further communication around that and so on. We are, as I mentioned before, in the middle of designing an electric car. It is complicated, but by the time we finish, there will be a rule book, there will be a reporting metric, and there will be comparability across Europe in terms of understandings of what is sustainable. That's what we need to know. And it will become much, much easier to use than it looks like when people are still figuring out how to connect certain wires to other plugs and so on, which is where we are now. But it is a major initiative, extraordinary issue with far-reaching consequences, not only for Europe, but also for all the countries that use European capital, that take advantage of European finance institutions, either internationally or to raise capital here, and any European institution, of course, that invests globally. So it will ripple around the world. It is already rippling around the world, which is why we have 20 other national taxonomy projects underway, which broadly mirror what we've been doing. This will be available very soon as a recording on climatebonds.net, search for webinars, or on YouTube, search for EU Taxonomy or Climate Bonds Initiative. I want to draw your attention to next week's webinar, when Helena and I and a mystery guest will be joining you to talk about what it means for investors. Please join us for a drill down and look on this page in front of you at the other events we've got coming out: corporations, social taxonomy, significantly harmful and no significant harmful impact taxonomies with Nancy Sage, who's been kindly listening in. What it means for banks. Nadia Humphreys will be joining us some of these, who's the co-rapporteur of the Usability and Data Working Group. And there'll be a lot of information being produced in written form during the course of the rest of the year. We appreciate your questions. They help us guide the kind of information we need to produce, the answers we need to create. So keep them coming. Please let us know any further questions, and let's see how we can go at addressing them over the next few weeks. Helena, thank you for joining us. I'm going to be talking to you again, same time next week. If you haven't registered for the series, folks, look for the URL and register now. Go back and register for the whole series. Thank you so much for joining us. Very exciting.
Thank you.
Arrivederci, au revoir.
Au revoir.